Greetings, I'm Bill Klatke, and I'd like to welcome you to today's edition of Neighborhood Beat. Our show today has as guest Dr. Thomas Schaller, who is a professor of political science for the University of Maryland at Baltimore County and a Baltimore Sun columnist. Tom, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Bill. Thank you.
It's good to have you. It's good to have you. First of all, for our viewers who are unfamiliar, could you please tell us a little bit about what you do?
Well, I've been a political scientist, as you said, at UMBC since 1998, so I'm in my 14th year. I'm an Americanist by training. In other words, I do American politics, and more specifically, I study and write and follow mostly campaigns and elections and representation and parties. Those are my primary areas of interest. The presidency and Congress and interest groups at sort of a secondary level. I teach classes in that, but don't write as much about that. I follow presidential elections pretty closely and congressional elections and party politics, and have written about that, and I'm writing about that now. So that's basically my area of coverage as a political scientist at UMBC.
That keeps you busy?
It keeps me pretty busy, yeah. I've been there 14 years, got great students. We have a fantastic university. That's really an up-and-coming university with a really incredible president, Freeman Hrabowski. We're winning awards after awards over there at UMBC. And, it's interesting, Bill, I'm as old as the university. When I first got there in 1998, I was 30 years old at the time. The university was founded in 67, 68 when I was born, and I was born in 67. So I'm in the first generation of college professors that's actually younger than the university, which is very uncommon, right? Most universities are far older. Four-year universities are far older than 40 years. And so Freeman, whenever he sees me, sort of jokes about how I'm sort of in that generation of the university generation that's younger, that came to the campus and was born after the university was founded.
Right, because he's a little bit older.
He's a little bit older, not much older. He's pretty. I think he was university president at my age, or maybe a little younger. I think he took over the university presidency at 42 or 43. He's a pretty amazing personal story and a professional story as well. He's won a lot of national awards and so forth for himself and for the university.
Amen, amen. And what's your background?
I grew up in Albany, New York, in the suburbs of Albany, and I'm a product of public schools, including the State University of New York system, where I got my undergraduate degree. I got a master's degree at Florida State and took my PhD in 1997 at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So I'm a Tar Heel fan, which may offend a lot of the Terp fans in the audience today, but I started I'm excited, for my Carolina Tar Heels basketball team. Finished there, taught a year at Ohio University while I was finishing my dissertation, which I wrote on prohibition repeal amendments, actually. Then I taught a year at Binghamton University back in my home state. These were just temporary one-year jobs, sort of filling in for faculty on leave. And then the University of Maryland job at UMBC opened up as a tenure-track job, and I applied for it and got it, and I've been there happily ever since.
That's wonderful. And you said that your research interests have been largely in politics, American politics. Yeah,
American politics. I didn't, there's different fields in political science, comparative government, international relations, political theory, political methods. I don't do those areas. I was trained in the American subfield, if you will, which really only exists for political scientists in the United States. In other parts of the world, America is just another country in the comparative context. Right. But in American political science graduate programs, you can specialize as an Americanist. So I was trained at UNC by people who taught and studied American politics, and then within that there's lots of little subfields. There are people who do courts, and there are people who do public opinion, and all sorts of other subfields within the American sort of field of study. And so I have slowly gravitated toward campaigns and elections and parties, which is what interests me the most.
Yeah, I know that you have a number of publications. Yeah, one Devolution and Black Politics? Yeah,
I wrote a book with my co-author, who actually teaches at UMBC also, Tyson King Meadows, about devolution of black state legislators. It's really just a full examination of the state of black state legislative politics. We wrote it sort of in the late 90s, early part of this decade, so we were looking at it at the turn of the century. 40 years ago, there were only 60 or 70 black state legislators, and by 2000, there were more than 600. And so we were looking at the changes in the development of black state politics in about 30 states that have significant enough black populations and a significant number of black state legislators, how their caucuses work, how they vote, what votes divide the caucus, what votes bring the caucuses together, how they leverage their politics in committees and on the floor, what their electoral districts are like and their election experiences are like. We interviewed a lot of black state legislators, and what we found was that when the conservative movement began in the 60s and the post-Goldwater movement, and there was this sort of fear of large government, a lot of conservatives said, let's push power away from Washington and move it back into the states. And for some people, that was, born of a notion of federalism and there's too much centralized government. But for some people, it was coded racism. It was a way of taking power away from African Americans who were pretty strongly empowered by federal law and federal courts. And they said, let's put the power back in the states, because the states were dominated still by white politicians and white elites. What's interesting now is that when you send power back to the states, whether it's to Albany or to Atlanta, you're actually putting power in greater hands of African Americans, because African Americans are significant chunks, significant shares of the state legislatures in a way that they weren't 40 years ago. So to devolve power to the states is actually to give power to African Americans in a way that it was originally intended to take it away from them. So that was sort of the irony of the book, was talking about how a devolution process of neo-federalism to move power back to the states was intended to sort of hamstring black power in a way that it actually emboldens or empowers black elites today.
How would you you wrote that in the late 90s. What about its relevance to today? Has this subsequent period confirmed or denied?
Yeah, black state representation has sort of leveled off since about 2000. There have been small gains there. I mean, the African-American population has hovered now for the better part of a decade at about 12%. So it's almost as if it's reached sort of a leveling off period. But there was rapid growth in the 80s and 90s. You went from a period, like I said, the 1960s, where there were only 50 or 60 black state legislators in the entire country. And at its high water mark, there was at least one black state legislator in, I think, 43 of the 50 states when it got up over 600. But it sort of leveled off there, because the African-American population is growing at about the same rate as the national population as a whole. Latino population, on the other hand, is outpacing. And so we're seeing gains being made by, Latino elites on the state level and on the national level. So, people are writing about that a little bit more now, I think. But black power is much more entrenched now. You have second-generation African-Americans in the state legislature whose parents were state legislators in a way that you couldn't have a legacy. And in the 1960s and 70s, when the pioneering black state legislators got in, their parents, didn't have college educations. Now we're having second and third generations, like a Jesse Jackson Jr. and people like that. And there are state legislators whose mothers and fathers were in the state legislature in the same state before them. So we're getting multi-generational black dynasties, if you will, in a way that was unfathomable 30 or 40 years ago.
Yeah. So and the devolution of if you will, the decentralization of power, that really is almost kind of the same impact as it was before?
Well, the basic argument that Tyson and I make in the book is that when you devolve power today, you actually put it in black hands and in a way that you didn't 30 or 40 years ago, even though when, the devolutionary movement, the decentralization movement started with Nixon in the late 60s and early 70s, it was a way of disempowering liberals and black liberals in particular on the national level, who were winning a lot of court cases on issues like civil rights and on issues like welfare and so forth like that, and busing and so forth. And they said, let's put it back to the states, where let states make individual policies for each state. But implicit in that was the notion that there's very little black power on the state level. Well, that's no longer the case. And so the irony, as we say, the irony of devolution is that to do it today actually gives more power, not less, to black elites on the state level.
I guess it depends upon the state, though, as to whether or not the black population level and the voting level is...
Sure. I mean, blacks are still underrepresented when you look at state legislatures. They might be 20 or 22% of the state population, but only 15% of the state legislatures. Here in Maryland, about 30% of the population is African American, but they don't have 30% of the seats in the state legislature. And there's a variety of reasons for that. And we look at that in terms of, districting and gerrymandering and so forth. But the ratio is much closer. I mean, you look at the U.S. Senate, right? You have 12% of African Americans. Nationally, you have 0 black senators, right? Because you have to win statewide there. And so, African Americans can win in districts that are carved as majority-minority districts, which is easier to do on the state level than on Congress, and certainly easier than in the Senate, where you can't create a majority black district in any state.
So that decentralization of power works in a number of states.
In a number of states, yeah. I mean, certainly the states
and probably that's why it continues to be a goal of folks that are interested in that?
Well, I think, that's the part of what we talk about, is that African Americans first had to go to the federal government when, they were being mistreated and civil rights were being deprived, and there were discrepancies and huge disparities in terms of public services and schools, and they needed federal intervention. And what we're saying now is that actually they have enough power that they can either prevent bad things from happening or make good things happen on a state level. And so being empowered on the state level is important in terms of the advancement of African American communities. You know, if you think about education alone, about 1/3 to 2/3 of most state budgets is on education K through 12 alone, right? And who controls that? Not politicians in Washington, politicians in Albany and Atlanta and, you know, in Trenton and Tallahassee. So to have legislators in those state capitals, and there's a significant black caucus in Albany and Atlanta and Trenton and Tallahassee, is more important than saying having a few more members of Congress down in Washington or one extra black senator, because those budgetary decisions are made in those state capitals, not in Washington.
So if you really want to influence, if our viewers really want to influence day-to-day things going on in their states, they should give their money to local candidates rather than to the...
Yeah, there's this great irony that the rate of turnout is lower in state elections when there's no national ballots, and certainly city elections in odd years. We know that the turnout is lower when the president's not on the ballot, even in even-numbered federal years, right? 2010, 2006, there's a significant drop-off in terms of turnout. But politics that matters to people on a day-to-day basis is much more important on the state and local level. I mean, almost everything that you get in terms of a license for your car, a license for your dog, a license, your property taxes all decided on a state and local level, and yet people are more likely to turn out for a presidential race than they are for a gubernatorial race or a county executive's race, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, and it seems that people are also, perhaps you've seen the data, I haven't, people are more likely to give money to... On
a federal race, that's right, yeah.
Right, sure. Right. And so the local candidates who are really starving for the money, right, to fund their campaigns that actually can make a difference in people's lives.
Right, and $100, and not to mention, your $100 would go a lot farther in a county exec's race than it would in a governor's race, and then certainly in a presidential race. I mean, Obama raised $750 million, $750 million, and your $100 isn't insignificant. But as a percentage of a race that you could run for a county executive that might run for $75,000, as opposed to $750 million, you have 1,000 times impact $100 contribution in a county executive race than a presidential race.
See, now there's a nonpartisan. Right. A nonpartisan nugget of knowledge for folks in an election season.
Yeah, your money's going to go a lot farther in a small race by definition.
That's right. We've been talking a little bit about what a political scientist. I guess we've been showing how a political scientist can actually bring some nuggets of understanding and wisdom to a common person. Right. A common person. Let's talk about political science just for a minute.
Okay.
You're a professor of political science, and you've talked a little bit about what political science is and how it's divided. How can and how does a political scientist like you communicate and deal with regular folks? How can I know that you work through the Baltimore Sun, you're on this program, you publish, you do various things for the State Department in various countries. Right. How is you as a political scientist relevant to what individuals are doing out there?
Well, I have a unique platform, as you point out. I mean, I can write about politics in the Baltimore Sun in 700 words, and not everybody can do that. But, increasingly, a lot of academics have their own blogs where they can, express not just opinions, but announce their research and announce the applicability of their research to everyday politics. And increasingly, a lot of faculty members, certainly after they get tenure and they don't have to worry about any complications from blogging and stuff, we're seeing an increasing number of websites. I mean, I only see them on political science, but I assume that they're happening in sociology and demography and psychology and other fields as well, where people can say, look, here's what my research is about. And normally you would only hear about this if you're another demographer at a panel at some conference where there's no cameras and there's no transcript. But here I can put it out on the internet with a bunch of links to a PDF, and you can see how it's relevant to sort of understanding, urban studies when I did a study of demography in Baltimore City or something. For me, I have an extra unusual opportunity because I can write 700 words, as I do every other Wednesday for the Baltimore Sun, and talking about things that I think are relevant. And I write as a theme a lot about, for example, economic inequality and understanding the political economy, how decisions of government in terms of setting tax policy and welfare policies affect who gets what and when and where from government. So I write a lot about how we tax, how we tax wealth versus how we tax worth, how our country's becoming more stratified between haves and have-nots, and why that is, why we have lowered the taxes on inherited wealth. We've lowered the taxes on wealth from income gains as opposed to work gains. So I have written a series of columns over the last few years, just sort of building a case about paying attention to political decisions because they affect your pocketbook in a very real way. That's kind of, if I have an agenda, so to speak, a theme that I write about regularly, that's how I try to say, like, look, the decisions of government do matter on both the national and the state level because they affect, your tax rates and whether you're rewarded for this or incentivized for this or that. And so that's what I write about a lot. And I have an unusual platform, unlike most academics or even political scientists, but there are ways increasingly now with the internet that people can broadcast what they're saying to a general audience in a way that they never could before.
Yeah. What's the best way to get in touch with you?
The best way to get in touch with me, I put my email, my personal email, the same one my mother emails me to, at the bottom of all my columns, Schaller67@gmail, Schaller 67@gmail. And people can follow me on Twitter at Schaller67. It's the same prefix as my Gmail account, and that's the best way really to get in touch with me. Either follow me on Twitter or send me an email. I try to respond to every person who writes in about my column, even people who are often very angry and rude and use all kinds of expletives. I try to respond to everybody at least once, and as long as they continue to be polite, I'll respond repeatedly. And if they're a little too abrasive, then I just say, look, I have to discontinue this conversation. So I get a lot of angry emails, but I also get a lot of favorable emails too. So, and I appreciate, when people take the time to sit down. I mean, that really means something to them, something that I wrote, even if it's infuriating or whether it's very exciting for them.
Yeah, that's great. That's wonderful that you do that, because it is a dialogue. It is a dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, people ask me how I write columns, and I guess I have sort of a panel of people in my head that are people that I know, mentors and friends and whatever, and I think this is who I'm writing for. This is my, sort of a proxy for my audience. Like, I have several people in my head, and I think I'm writing this for them because they're a stand-in for the larger audience.
You're debating with them.
Yeah, and the other thing is, people also say, like, what motivates you to write? And I have to say, at a certain level, anger. I think you have to have something that is animating you, and that is, you have to get out. I can understand, though I'm no poet, why a poet needs to write a poem, because it's inside her, and she needs to express that. And for me, as a columnist, I'm angry about something. I hear something on television, or I look at, Mitt Romney paying a 14% tax rate when I'm paying a 14% tax rate, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to write a column about that, and why is that, and why do we tax wealth at a lower rate than we tax people who work? It's absurd, and something needs to be done about that. So I pretty much start every column with anger at a certain level. I mean, it's a controlled anger. I'm not throwing things across the room, but I've got something to say, and I think if you don't have that sort of fire in the belly, at some point, you hear college coaches, they retire or resign, they say, I just didn't feel like coming into work that day. At some point, maybe I'll reach that point, and that's when I'll know I have to give up the column.
Right. But until then, and the column is different than your academic work.
Right, of course.
Because your academic work is nonpartisan and objective and professional.
Right, and data-oriented and so forth.
And the Sun is deliberately partisan.
The Sun is deliberately partisan, and I'm allowed to say whatever I want, which is nice. I'm very ideological in my column, and I'm a liberal, and there's no hidden secrets to that. But one of the things I do try to do in my column, Bill, is I do try to bring, academic work in there in a very subtle way, sort of, not a lot of data downloading and data dumping, and you can't obviously put a chart or a figure in your column.
It's 700 words.
Right, it's very hard to get things. Usually when I write a column, it starts, when I write it up to about 1,100, and then you learn how to essentialize, which is more of a writing and editing task. Something I try to teach my students. I taught a class in political writing last fall, which was very instructive, and we learned how to write a letter to the editor and an op-ed and a column and a political speech and these sorts of things. So I always tell my students, write the full argument and then essentialize. Can you say this in 14 words instead of 24 words, and can you take this whole paragraph out? And I do the same thing every other week. I write a column, and it usually gets up around 1,000 words, and then I'm like, okay, what's got to stay and what's got to go?
My wife would appreciate me consensualizing.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's hard to essentialize, but it's writing is editing, as I tell my students. Anybody can put a bunch of words down. It's moving them around that matters most.
Let's roll back to the economic inequality, a subject that is very dear to my heart in dealing with civil rights. We're never very far away from questions of how much does civil rights go to a certain point and then economic inequality start.
Right. Because
there's an intermingling of the two. There is an argument, there's always an argument about economic inequality, but the data's pretty clear, right?
Right, and I mean, this is an argument that you've heard from particularly, black scholars, whether it's W.E.B. Du Bois or whether it's Martin Luther King, that political equality only matters if you have it doesn't matter if you can get into the theater if you can't afford the ticket.
That's right.
So, I think political and social movements start with political equality and then eventually move into economic equality. Same thing for women, right? You have equal rights, but if you don't have equal pay, what's the point? So, that's the sort of natural cycle, I think, is you fight to make sure you have the franchise, that you can vote and you can participate, and you can write checks, you can run for office or what have you. And then once you get in, you use political power to achieve economic equality. I mean, this notion that markets decide and they're fair, is belied by the fact that the same people who tend to conservatives say, well, markets will matter, and markets will create an equilibrium, and markets will create justice and fairness for the people who are smart and work hard, and I think there's some truth to that. But what you realize is that people, once they gain economic power, use it to buy political power to reinforce and to maintain their economic advantages, and that's a problem. That's not capitalism. Capitalism is not using your money to buy the political system to reinforce pre-existing disparities, and that's clearly what's happening right now. It's clearly a situation where the 1% of the top 10% are using their economic clout to reinforce through the political system that advantage, and that's not a meritocracy. I mean, one of the things that bothers me, and I've written about recently, is the United States is a country where knowing who your father or mother is a stronger predictor of a kid's income than it is in those so-called socialist countries like I just traveled to recently, like Finland and Sweden, Denmark. You're more likely to rise and fall between generations in the socialist countries than you are in America, where supposedly pluck and luck and hard work matter. No, who's your daddy matters more in the United States than the European countries, and that's an unfortunate reality, but that's because of the way that we've structured the political system, particularly with respect to inherited wealth.
But that, of course, is also completely against various American myths.
Right. I mean, the whole American ethos is about making it on your own, about rags to riches, about, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And what I'm saying is that when you look at it statistically, that is less common today than it was 30 or 40 years ago. We've become an entrenched and stratified class-based society in a way that we don't like to think of class. We fought a revolution to get away from monarchies. We fought a revolution to get away from that, and that's where we are. We're moving toward the kind of country that we wish we weren't and pretend that we're not, but increasingly we are.
Is that because of the recession?
No, this predates the recession. I mean, when you look at the changes in economic disparity, they all began in the late 1970s, and a variety of tax policy changes, the attacks on unions and so forth. I mean, it used to be a situation where, CEO pay to the lowest person was 7, 10, 20 to 1, and now it's 2 and 300 to 1. And we're moving toward a banana republic with the declining middle class. And that's unfortunate for democracy, because we know that democracies tend to thrive when they have a strong and vibrant middle class, like we did after the Second World War, and that middle class is devolving into an underclass and an overclass, and that's a real problem. And people are finally starting to talk about this after, really 30 years of letting it languish.
We've been analyzing, we've got a few minutes left.
Sure.
You've been analyzing the current situation. And one of the things that always drives me crazy when I teach is the and when I talk to my wife about various things, is the students and my wife are interested in what are the solutions.
Right.
What are the solutions? What can our viewers do about the things? Because we've been over, and you mentioned a number of things that should concern people very, very deeply.
Right.
What can people do?
Well, when I give lectures in presidential years like I do, I just told you I'd come back from Finland and Sweden and Norway, and I'll be going to Spain and to Greece and to Zimbabwe and Zambia later this year. They always ask me, like, America, you're exporting your ideas and your democracy through the State Department programs like the very program you're in, but you have very low turnout, and it's only 60% of the people vote, and that's in a presidential year, and a non-presidential year drops into the 40s, and in odd year elections it can drop into the 20s for local elections. What kind of democracy are you selling us when it's not particularly healthy at home? And you have super PACs, and you have the influence of millionaires and who can single-handedly fund to keep a particular candidate afloat. And it's hard to explain that to them, right? It's hard to explain some of these problems. And I think we do need some political and structural reform, in terms of elections, in terms of how we draw districts, in terms of campaign finance. We need to figure out, a lot of countries require people to register, and even some countries require people to vote. Here it's all passive registration, right? We don't let people passively pay their taxes or get their Social Security number. We take their taxes out of their paycheck every every 2 weeks. So if we can do that, if we can force people to pay taxes, why can't we mandate people at least register to vote? Maybe not force them to vote.
You'd think that'd be basic in a democracy.
Right. But, in a democracy, the people who are in office have won by definition under the current set of rules. So why would they tinker with the rules? They don't want full participation. Imagine a society where we had full participation. We know that older people vote more than younger people. We know that wealthier people vote at higher rates than poorer people. Do you think the people in power want to change that dynamic? Of course they don't. I mean, I don't mean to sound conspiratorial or cynical. It's just a reality. Of course, if you're in power, you don't want to tinker with the system that's made you a winner.
It's basically self-interest.
That's right. So, we need some structural political reform and campaign finance reform and all that. And, we need people to become more involved. We have a very apathetic country, and I think people take America for granted sometimes. And, sometimes you need people in the streets. And I think what we've seen since Obama's election is two sort of movements. One, the Tea Party movement, that's sort of a criticism of the left, but it's an internal criticism of the right's failure to speak to its own coalition. And then quickly thereafter, we saw Occupy Wall Street, which again, externally is a criticism of the right and inequality and all these things. But prior to that is ultimately, right, a criticism of the left not making that argument,
right? It's a curious mirror, isn't it?
Right, yeah. And so both parties or coalitions or left and right have seen insurrections within saying, hey, you're not talking about the things that people should be talking about, right? It's a serious problem when we have a financial meltdown because we have unregulated credit default swaps, and 99 out of 99 members of Congress from both parties voted for the law to keep that deregulated, right? Something is fundamentally wrong when both parties are voting on the same side of an issue, like deregulation of a whole entire financial system that then collapses. And so both parties have had their, coming from different approaches, right? Both parties have seen an insurrection internally to their coalition saying, look, you're not listening to your own voters and your own side anymore. Yeah. And that, to me, is sort of as a thermometer, is a testament to the fact that there's something unhealthy with our democracy.
Yeah, yeah. And that if people want to do something about it, they got to do something about it. They have to stop just being irritated and complaining to their wives.
Yeah,
and husbands and significant others.
I mean, because of our wealth, I think, we have a lot of distractions, right? We're easily distracted. It's easier to just sort of turn on the Xbox or turn on the TV or the DVR. I'm a big Washington Capitals fan. Sometimes I'd rather just tune out and watch my hockey team than pay attention to politics. But you have an obligation as a citizen in a democracy to do your civic duty, at the very least to vote, and maybe to contribute to a campaign, or maybe work on a campaign, or maybe write a letter to the Baltimore Sun or to a politician. And too few people do that, unfortunately.
Yeah, indeed. We're out of time, Tom.
Sure.
How can somebody get in touch with you one more time?
They can email me at schaller67@gmail.com, SCHALLER67@gmail.com. That email's at the bottom of all my columns in the Baltimore Sun, so you can also go there. You can obviously get the RSS feed or get a Google alert for my columns, and you can follow me on Twitter at Schaller67.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Great to be here, Bill.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Unfortunately for Neighborhood Beat, that's all we have time for today. I want to thank our guest, Dr. Tom Schaller, who is a professor of political science at the University of Maryland at Baltimore County and a Baltimore Sun columnist, for being our guest today. Thank you, Tom.
Great to be here.
Keep up your good work for all of us.
All right, thanks, Bill.
And I want to thank you for tuning in. Let's try to be a good neighbor out there in all of our neighborhoods, and we'll see you next time.